In this video, we're talking about what I personally think is the best freestanding tent you could possibly buy for one or maybe two people. This is the budget setup that we have here at Dan Becker Outdoors in my backyard.
Yeah, just pretty wet out here. Just pretty wet. It's been a wet, rainy summer here in Wisconsin.
So the tent we're talking about today is the Nemo Hornet. And I'll show you a few shots of the original entry-level Nemo Hornet. And then today I've also got the older Nemo Hornet Elite, and we'll explain some of the differences of the entry level and the Elite. And then we've also got like the new version of the Elite Hornet. Now I started using this tent maybe 5 years ago, and there are a lot of freestanding and semi-freestanding tents that I've used over the years. And there are new ones always coming out on the market, but I have yet to find a better tent than this for a lot of reasons.
Oh,
Check
yeah.
cartwheel.
Yeah, cartwheel.
Check this out.
Parkour.
Parkour!
This is the tent that I've got by far the most use out of. This is the original Nemo Hornet Elite tent. Now I've gotten a ton of use out of the entry-level Nemo Hornet, the like original one, but this has been my go-to tent for many years as a freestanding tent. The biggest difference between this tent and the original Hornet Elite is the fabric. This is a 7 denier nylon and the original was like a 10 denier nylon. And that just means that the fabric's slightly thinner and possibly more prone to getting rips and tears on it. But I've had it for many years. I don't got a single hole in it. Matter of fact, every one of my Dyneema tents, pretty sure every one of my Dyneema tents has a hole in it. Now they've upgraded to this tent here. The biggest difference between this tent and the original tent is the fabric. This is the Osmo fabric on this tent. And there's a few other minor differences, like they've got some toggles that are slightly different. On this tent here, the back corners where you would attach the rain fly to the tent itself, it's just awkward. You gotta sort of bend the clip underneath the tent pole. This one, they made it just one system that's really easy to snap into. And then on the front of this tent, you'll notice that this sort of kind of comes up right here. And that's really about the only other difference other than the color. I actually like the color of this one. This one's a little bit more low profile or stealthy when you're out there. So if you don't want people to see you or know exactly where you're at, this is probably the better color. And I like it a lot more than the bright green color that they, I think, got a lot of complaints about. But the biggest reason that I love this tent is that it's the perfect size for one person to go backpacking. Now they do make a one-person version of this tent. This is the two-person version, but this one is like, you got plenty of room in there. You got more room than you need, which is always nice to have more room because you can kind of lay your junk out. But the footprint on this tent is so small. And the big way that they did that is that they got this headroom really crunched up and small. So for one person inside of this tent, that's really perfect because you're not gonna be moving around all over the place inside of this tent. And with the headroom coming together into sort of a super narrow spot at the top, that's also gonna bring the vestibules in closer together. So you're not gonna have the footprint of the tent sort of pushing out much bigger, and it makes it more difficult to get into sort of different campsites that you'd want in a smaller area. It makes it a lot easier to find your campsite. So Nemo, over the years, decided that they wanted two new tents that aren't really new. They're just sort of upgrades to the old tent. And what are the upgrades? Like, what did they actually do to make them different? Well, one of the differences between the original entry level and this one here, which is the upgraded Nemo Hornet, is that the brow pole, which is really just a tiny little plastic piece that almost doesn't look like a brow pole, but it just sort of gives you a little bit more headroom. There's only one now in this tent versus two. Now, I don't notice the difference at all when I'm inside of it. I think it was the right decision to make because it takes a little weight out of the tent and it doesn't really make that much of a difference for your headroom at all. This is the super expensive, but amazingly awesome Nemo Hornet Elite. So what is the massive upgrade? What is the difference between the entry level and this one? Well, price for one, but also the weight. This one's gonna cut out 4 to 5 ounces of weight out of your tent altogether. Both of these tents are made with the new Osmo fabric, and this fabric was completely designed by Nemo, and it supposedly has 4 times longer lasting water repellency, 3 times less stretch when wet, and it's 20% stronger than the original fabric that was on the previous tents. The other thing about this fabric, because it apparently doesn't stretch as much in rain, is I haven't had a chance to test this tent in the rain up until today. So I thought the best person to actually test this for us, outside of Nemo, outside of me, somebody who's actually used this tent more than I have, is my buddy Steven at My Life Outdoors, who I sent a piece of fabric of this tent to down in Texas. It was actually the footprint to the tent, and I sent that because I know how much Steven loves footprints.
Thanks, Dan. I'm out here in beautiful East Texas. I got the footprint that you sent. I went ahead and picked up 2 other footprints, one that's made out of polyester, the other one that's made out of nylon. I'm gonna run some tests against the Osmo fabric. I'm gonna see not only which one is the lightest, but which one stretches the least once you get it wet. I took all 3 footprints, making sure they were all around 70 denier fabrics, and I cut identical strips of each material and attached them to this rig to test Nemo's claim that Osmo fabric stretches 3 times less than nylon. With 2-pound weights attached to each strip of material, I did a dry run for 30 minutes. Okay, so we've got about 30 minutes on all 3 pieces of these materials, and so far, on a dry stretch, there doesn't seem to be, or at least there seems to be very minimal stretching. As expected, the nylon seems to be stretching the most. Polyester does seem to stretch just a little bit more than the Osmo fabric, but for the most part, I'm seeing very little stretch on all of these materials. Now it's time to soak them in some water for a little bit and see if they stretch once they're wet. Soak the fabrics in water for several hours. Once fully soaked, the nylon stretched about 3/4 of an inch near the bottom of the fabric. The polyester stretched maybe 1/8 to 1/4 inch, and surprisingly, the Osmo didn't seem to stretch at all. Which really surprised me because all of Osmo's stretch resistance comes from its polyester fibers. So you would think the 100% polyester fabric would stretch even less. But at least in this really quick and simple test, Osmo did the best. So, is it legit? I saw no perceivable stretch in a material that is just as light as nylon. Back to you, Dan.
I never know stats. All right, I already know some of the super tent nerds out there want to know every detail about these tents, and I'm not going to be able to remember them when we film these videos. So we're going to put all the stats on the entry-level Nemo Hornet right here, and all the stats for the Nemo Hornet Elite right here. I guess let me tell you some of the things I just don't like about this tent. Honestly, there really isn't much. I guess the biggest thing that I don't like about this tent is that there's no dual zipper on the door. I think that's an opportunity missed. I think it's a very simple add to the tent. And I think it is a great way to ventilate the tent, because when you've got a dual zipper on the door, in other words, when you can unzip it from the top or the bottom, then you can, if you've ever wondered what the dual zipper is on your tent, that's really so you can unzip just a tiny bit of the top to help ventilate up there and still keep the rest of the vestibule zipped closed. So I definitely think that was an opportunity missed. I guess if I'm really nitpicking the headroom, I mean, it's sort of a downer in this tent because it does sort of narrow up, but it's not really honestly that big of a deal because I hardly spend any time in my tent ever, unless I'm like waiting on a storm, which really doesn't happen all that often. One other thing is that the brow pole is actually attached to the inner tent, to the actual tent. So it's not separate from the pole structure that you would pack up separately. So I guess when you're packing it up, this sort of does get in the way just slightly, but I mean, I'm struggling to think of things when I talk about this tent. Now, I've heard other people talk about this that they don't like. It's never been a situation that I've dealt with at all. I've never had this happen to me whatsoever. But some people have complained that because the back side of this tent comes up, that when this portion gets rain on it, it actually leaks inside of the tent. I have never had that happen on any of the tents from Nemo, the Nemo Hornets that I've used. I guess you can sort of see a little bit of pooling right here that could potentially get inside of the tent if it sort of kind of comes through. But again, man, that's just totally nitpicking in my opinion. So what if you buy the 2-person tent because you got 2 people that want to go backpacking and you're both going to share the tent? Are you going to be okay inside of this tent? The short answer is yes, you're going to be just fine. You can survive in this tent just fine. But if you are going to spend more time in this tent besides just sort of the sleeping part, you know, it is going to be tight. Can you both sit up at the same time? Yeah, but your head's going to be kind of touching the net portion of the top of the tent. So if you're gonna consistently be using this tent as a 2-person tent, this probably isn't the tent for you as a 2-person tent, especially if you do like to spend a lot of time in your tent. But 1-person tent, 2 people, every once in a while, it is an amazing tent. So if you already own the original Nemo Hornet or the Hornet Elite, should you be upgrading to this tent here or this tent right behind me? I don't think so. I think you're absolutely fine with this tent over here. Honestly, I never would have upgraded to this tent had I not been making YouTube videos to tell you about this tent. I love that yellow tent. That is still my absolute favorite tent of all time as a freestanding tent. Like, there's nothing that even comes close to that tent, in my opinion. But this one is probably gonna be better just for the little things that we've already mentioned. So what do you think? Is this the best freestanding tent on the market for a 1 or possibly 2-person tent? Let me know in the comments below, even if you don't like it. And we'll see you on the next one.
YouTube is a rabbit hole of information. So in order to solve that problem, I wrote a backpacking course where I took my 10 years of backpacking experience and the 400 YouTube videos that I filmed and condensed it down into just 18 videos and a few lessons for you to learn. All you have to do is go to my brand new website, danbeckeroutdoors.com, and look for the course.